You're watching Philosophical Roast, today's brew. Extra light roast. TMN on the ontological argument.
A criticism that I repeatedly got was that William Lane Craig's version of the argument doesn't simply add existence to the definition of God. My detractors argue that William Lane Craig doesn't say that existing is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being. Well, let's listen to what exactly Craig says.
If a being of that nature exists in even one possible world, then it exists in all of them, because that's part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being.
Can you say that again, Billy?
Because that's part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being.
Existing in all possible worlds is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being. He does in fact say that existence is part of, or at the very least implied by, the very definition of God. So even Craig's version of the ontological argument tries to commit the same silly trick of simply defining God into existence.
No, because Craig does not define God as a being which exists. The objector states that
existing in all possible worlds is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being.
From this he concludes
Existence is part of, or at the very least implied by, the very definition of God.
However, this is simply false and a gross misunderstanding of the modal ontological argument. Saying that
existing in all possible worlds is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being
doesn't mean that
existence is part of, or at the very least implied by, the very definition of God.
Rather, saying that
existing in all possible worlds is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being
means necessary
existence is part of, or at the very least implied by, the very definition of God.
Not existence, but necessary existence. Necessary, 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 necessary. And here's why. Because the statement
existing in all possible worlds
is equivalent to saying that it exists necessarily. Thus, existing in all possible worlds is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being is the same as saying existing necessarily is part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being. Maybe this part of the interview with Dr. Craig which was left out might be relevant after all.
And he would be necessary in his existence. He would exist in all possible worlds.
Necessary used by Craig is a philosophical term used to denote a particular type of modality. Existence itself may not be a property, but necessary existence can certainly be a property because some things which exist can exemplify this property, and thus exist necessarily, and other things which exist can lack this property, and merely exist contingently. This is made very clear in the published work of Dr. Craig and Plantinga.
Now, you may be able to formulate a concept of God that requires you to think of God as existing, but whether you think of God as existing has nothing to do with whether God actually exists.
I agree. Fortunately, the ontological argument doesn't include a premise which states that if one can formulate a concept of God which requires one to think God exists, then God actually exists.
All ontological arguments make this same mistake.
Except all the ones that don't make that mistake. The mistake you are referring to is based on a misunderstanding of the argument and an inattention to detail when appreciating the modal distinction between contingent existence and necessary existence.
Now, Craig's version of the argument does add the caveat that if it is possible for God to exist, then God does exist. In this formulation, God's existence is at least contingent upon God's existence being possible. Without that, the argument is simply a meaningless tautology. But even with this caveat, the argument still tries to conjure God into existence using only a definition, and it still fails.
It would seem that most arguments would fail if you don't understand them.
Craig and Plantinga's version of the argument says that a maximally great being, if it exists in any possible world, it exists in all possible worlds. What he means when he says possible worlds is conceivable scenarios.
This is not true. Dr. Craig does not hold that possible worlds are conceivable scenarios, as conceivable scenarios are contingent on which scenarios can be conceived and are thus subject-dependent. However, when Dr. Craig refers to possible world semantics, he uses the term possible world to have the same meaning as most philosophers and particularly metaphysicians when they use this term. On such a description, any possible world will not be a subject-dependent concept but a subjective independent concept and will be a complete description of the world regardless of our conception of it. A possible world is a way the world might be. One can think of a possible world as a maximal description of reality, nothing is left out. It may be thought of as a maximal state of affairs, which includes every other state of affairs or its complement, or as an enormous conjunction composed of every statement or its contradictory. In Dr. Craig's own words, he uses the term a maximal description of reality itself, not just our conception of reality. Although a conceivable scenario or conceivable world can be used as evidence of a logically possible world in which that scenario obtains, it is not the possible world itself. Conceivability of a possible world can be used to show that such a conceivable world can indeed be evidence of that possible world itself, where the possible world itself is a description of reality and not merely our conception of it. On the program Closer to Truth, Dr. Craig refers to a conceivable world or the ability to conceive of a possible world as reason to believe that there could exist such a possible world, implying that the two notions, first conceiving a possible world/conceivable world and a possible world itself, are distinct in nature. Unfortunately, the rest of the objection is based on a complete misunderstanding of the ontological argument, where possible worlds are incorrectly taken to mean conceivable scenarios and conceptions of reality, instead of as reality itself.
If a maximally great being exists in one conceivable scenario, it exists in all conceivable scenarios, which includes your conception of reality. Maximal greatness has to exist in all conceivable scenarios, because if it only existed in one or a few hypothetical scenarios, it would not be maximally great. To be maximally great, something must, by definition, exist in all conceivable scenarios. So if you say that it is hypothetically possible for maximal greatness to exist, you are placing it in a conceivable scenario. Since if you place it in one hypothetical scenario, you are placing it in all conceivable scenarios, then to say that maximal greatness is possible is equivalent to saying that maximal greatness is actual. If you accept this argument and you accept that maximal greatness is possible, it requires you to think of maximal greatness, and by extension God, as existing not just in hypothetical conceptions of reality, but also in your conception of actual reality. The problem is that your conception of actual reality is still just a conception. It is not reality itself. That's why the real core argument doesn't work, and that's why, for the same reason, none of the ontological arguments works.
This response seems to commit one to complete skepticism about reality itself and ultimately leads one to the belief that nothing can be known at all since everything is just a conception and thus can't be trusted to accurately represent reality. The problem with this view is that if this view is to be taken seriously, then everything that originates from a conception of reality shouldn't be trusted to accurately represent reality since it is not reality itself. However, the very view itself, that anything which originates from a conception of reality cannot be trusted to accurately represent reality itself, originates from a conception of reality and thus cannot be trusted either to accurately represent reality. In short, the very view itself is self-defeating. But even if you hold that possible worlds really are merely conceptions, it doesn't follow that the actual world is merely a conception as well and not an accurate conception of reality. All he has shown is that arguments are unlikely to work if you misunderstand them. Good to know.